Hi everyone, I'm Talia. I'm a developer advocate at Split. And before I did dev advocacy, I was a test engineer and I worked in QA and automation. And being a test engineer was really hard for me because a lot of the problems that I had revolved around using a staging environment or a test environment. And using staging would lead to so many issues. And these are some of the problems that I dealt with. So the first is that the data in staging doesn't match production, which means the test results don't always match. So I used to work so hard on testing every product requirement, and I used to go through the documentation with the product owner, and I would work with my developers to fix all the bugs and make sure my end-to-end tests were passing in staging. And then I would sign off on the feature, but as soon as it would be launched to production, there would be a bug. And it's such a horrible feeling as a test engineer or as any engineer when you work on a feature and it works well in staging and then you ship it to production and there's a bug. The next thing that I experienced is called a configuration drift. So what this means is, let's say you get paged one night because there's an incident for your mobile app, and you look at the logs and you identify the problem, but in order to fix it, you need to update a specific configuration in production. So you make the change in production and you go back to sleep. So although you fixed the issue, you've just created an even bigger divide between your staging environment and your production environment because you didn't make the same change in your staging environment. So many times staging environments are not the same as production because of changes made during incident management. And this is called configuration drift. The next thing I experienced is that staging is slow. Staging has really bad performance. So when you're writing tests in staging, you often have to add waits and sleeps because things take longer to load, right? And that's not how your user is going to interact with your features in production. And lastly, nobody cares if staging is down. So I would be assigned to test these hotfix tickets, which were just like critical bug fixes that needed to be immediately released to production. So I would log into staging to test it, but staging would be down. So I ping the DevOps guy and he tells me they're doing performance testing and staging. So I have to wait until that's done. And then I try logging in again this time, but I get the 404 screen of death. So I open an IT ticket and then I have to get it escalated by my manager, but she's at lunch. So I have to ping someone else. And meanwhile, I'm trying to test this high priority ticket and nobody seems to care. No one is going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is down. And I was so fed up with dealing with a really horrible testing experience and a really horrible staging environment and being blamed for when things didn't work. And so I thought that there has to be a better way to test software. We're doing something wrong. And this is what I learned. I did a ton of homework and researched what other companies are doing. And these are some of the things that I learned. So the first is that it's the norm for companies to use staging environments, especially companies that are still waterfall. Most companies have more than one staging environment, and big name companies like Google, Facebook, Netflix, and Twitter all test in production. And when I heard this, test in production, I thought, what is this? How is this possible? I've never heard of this practice before. So testing in production means testing your features in the environment that your features will live in, not using a dummy environment like staging. And I thought, wow, this is perfect. And the other thing that I learned with this process is that testing in prod doesn't mean you only test in prod. So you still use staging for GDPR and SOX related like data and privacy issues. And I thought, I have to start doing this. This solves all of my problems. How do I get started? What do I do? And the answer was feature flags. And feature flags are just a way to separate code deployment from feature release. So the idea is you deploy your code to production behind a feature flag, test it in prod, and then release the feature with a click of a button as soon as it's bug-free. So how does it work? You create a feature flag from the UI and then target all of your internal teammates. So dev, QA, product, design. So anything related to the feature can only be seen by the users that are inside of the feature flag because the default for the flag is off right now. So these people on the right, your real end users, they can't see anything related to the feature. And so while the feature flag is off, you go in and you test everything. You test all of your functionality, your design, you go through all your requirements and make sure that everything works. And if you happen to find a bug in your new feature, it has no impact on your end users because they don't have access to it. And then once you know your feature is working in production, you turn the flag on, already knowing 100% your features are working and you didn't break anything that was existing. And now your users are happy because you've released a perfect feature. And then you repeat this process with every new feature. So each feature gets its own feature flag. And I thought, that's all wonderful, but how do you automate it? Because you can't possibly manually test every feature every time you release. And with feature flags, you have this added complexity. So how do you automate it? And so there's two options for automation here. The first is that you target your test users and automate with the flows with them. So you would take your automation users, your automation bots, your test users, and target them inside of your feature flags, just like you targeted everyone else. And so every time automation bot A logs in, they're going to have access to the feature regardless because they're on that list. The only problem with this approach is that there is increased fragility in case someone removes that user from the targeting list, that test is going to fail. The next approach you can use is to override your feature flags. And basically what you do here is you make a custom feature flag abstraction. So for each feature, you would have 3 tests. In the first test, you simulate the feature flag on. In the second test, you simulate the feature flag off. And in the last test, you want to validate that you can go through the entire flow regardless of if the flag is on or off. So with this approach, you are explicit in the test, and the test becomes much more self-documenting and descriptive. When you're running tests in production, you want to make sure that your testing entities only interact with other testing entities and that you're not affecting real data in production. And the way that you do this is with this back-end flagging system. And this back-end flagging system is you can use data attributes, you can use ARIA labels, just something some property of each element that's going to say this is a test object and this is a real object. So in the past, I've used things like is test equals true, just a Boolean for all of your test objects, and then is test equals false. That's automatically set for any real user. And so when your data comes back into, like, if you're using Datadog or Looker, like all of your user data that comes back in, you can separate and say, all of my test data is going to be in this dashboard and all of my real data is going to be in this dashboard. And that's how you separate real data from test data in production. And that's how you make sure that your test data only interacts with other test data. There are exceptions. If your software is integrated with a third party, it can be tricky to test, but what you can do here is create a unique header in the API request that you send to the third party and say, hey, any request that you get with this header is a test, and I want you to treat it in this other way. A question that I get a lot is, how do you know what to test in prod? So there's 2 places that you can go for this information. The first is your product person. Your product person knows what the most business critical flows are for your product. And then also your data analyst knows what your users are doing the most in your application. So between those 2 lists, you should have a really good idea of where to start. If you're testing a change in production that includes a database migration, you want to be sure that you don't lose any data. And the safe and recommended way to do this is to wrap your feature flag around the elements of your code base, not your database. And so if there's a problem with your code and you need to revert, or if you decide you don't want to update the schema anymore, all you would need to do is change the code that's behind the feature flag without touching the database code. And then once the feature flag is deactivated, you could do a separate migration that's just going to drop that column or do whatever you wanted to do. And so let's say you're in front of a frozen lake and you're not sure if it's stable enough to hold you while you walk on it. So you stretch out your right leg, gently apply pressure, and then slowly move your left leg to meet your right leg. And you do this continuously to build your confidence until you reach the other end of the lake. But if you feel the ice crack underneath your leg, you would slowly revert your actions and go back, right? So this is called the expand contract pattern. And just as you need different versions of your software to work at the same time, you also need different versions of the database to work at the same time. Because in reality, you can't stop the world, update your code, and then start the world again, right? You have to do it gradually, which means more than one version is going to have to work at a time with the database. When you're migrating to a new database schema, you expand the schema to work with the old version and the new version, and then contract to work only with the new. What this does is it allows the gradual rollout of the new changes to be successful while knowing that the old code still works for your users who haven't gotten it yet. And so, for this process to be effective, each change on its own should be backwards compatible so that just in case you have to roll back, your database is still going to be valid. And so, when you're doing a database migration in production with feature flags, you're giving yourself this added layer of risk mitigation in case, quote unquote, the ice cracks and you don't end up making that change, or if the change doesn't work the way you expected in production. There are some other dependencies that you need besides feature flags to run tests in production. The first is an automation framework, just a tool that's gonna run your tests for you. That's gonna make it easy to know that your features are working immediately. You also need a job scheduler that's gonna run your tests incrementally. That's gonna run them when you push up new code. And then you also need an alerting tool that can be integrated with your job scheduler that's gonna alert you whenever a test fails. And so these are some of the tools that I've used that I'm comfortable recommending. So for feature flags, obviously, like I use Split, and it's what I've used that I recommend. For your automation framework, Robot Framework is amazing. Also Cypress I've used. You can also use Protractor for Angular applications. And then for job scheduling, you can use Jenkins, Circle CI, Travis, Maven. They're pretty much all the same. And then for alerting, there's PagerDuty, Slack. You can configure this to say like your most important critical business flows. If those fail, you need to be alerted through PagerDuty. And then if a less critical test fails, you can set that up through Slack. And this new process of testing in prod made total sense to me. And I hope it makes sense to you. But if it's so simple, why isn't everyone testing in production? Like, why do staging environments still exist if you have this process that solves all of your problems? And the answer is fear. People are scared. Companies don't test in production because of this fear and this lack of trust in their systems. And for the same reason, they refuse to invest in the tools and process changes that are going to generate that trust. So they're too afraid of those risks. And so let's talk about how we can mitigate some of the risks that are associated with testing in prod. So there's a few things that you can do. The first, like we talked about, use feature flags, target your internal teammates, test with them, and then turn the feature flag on when you know that your feature works in production. Next, you want to use a canary release after you launch. And what this means is it's just a percentage rollout. So this allows you to release your feature to a small subset of users before you release it to your entire user base. And so this is great because if something does go wrong, would you want 100% of your users to encounter the issue or 1%? Next, I suggest starting with an AA test. And what this means is that you give your users inside and outside of the feature flag the same experience and make sure that the data coming in is the same for both. And this is going to build your confidence in the feature flagging system. And lastly, you want to start small. You don't want to start out with the most complex flow and decide to test that in prod. You want to start with something simple. And the outcome of testing in prod was really amazing. You're able to release faster because your release is just the press of a button and your features are released. You have increased developer velocity because your developers spend more time creating new features and less time fixing bugs. You also have an increased confidence in releases because you know your features are working in the environments that your features will live in, not a dummy environment. And all of this promotes a really great team culture, a really great team happiness level. And in case I haven't convince you that this is a good idea. I just want you to think about the last feature that your team deployed. Is it working right now in production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, your alarms haven't gone off, and so you assume that it works, right? But you don't know. Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. And oftentimes, shifting your company's testing culture is the hardest part of this process. So, getting over that fear that we talked about. So, some things that you can do are to use examples from your past when you're talking to people. So, think about like, is your staging environment unreliable? I can tell you for a fact, yes, it is. Think about a time where you deployed something, you released a feature to production, and it worked perfectly in staging, and then it broke in production. Use these examples to help support your claim that this is something that you want to start doing. And then you want to start using feature flags. So go to split.io, click on free developer account, and you can go in and start using feature flags and setting up this process. And in case you haven't been paying attention at all for the past 20 minutes, I want you to take away two things. The first is that no one cares if your feature is working in staging, we care if it works in production. And the second is that the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. So thank you all for listening. This is my Twitter handle and my email address in case you guys want to email me questions. And I will head back over to Slack to continue our conversation. Thank you.